Okay, how's everybody doing, man? This is awesome. This is really cool. It's really encouraging just for the last, well, this is our fourth week now, for the last few weeks to just see the amount of people that we've had just take time out of their own weekly schedule to just say, I'm serious about this Jesus thing, and taking time out of your busy lives to just dig into God's Word. It's been really awesome. So glad you're here, and I'm excited, and I'm ready to do this thing. So tonight's going to be a little bit different, and I guess, it doesn't take knowing me and my dad very much to realize our personalities are quite different, and so we have different speaking styles, and he's a little more, I don't know, vocal, passionate. I'm a little more just kind of chilled and laid back, and so tonight will be a little bit different in terms of just style, and also I think a little different in terms of content. And if you're here last week, I was up here just for a couple minutes at the end and told you what I was going to be talking about, but just in case you weren't, I'm going to be talking about two things. And our approach to this discipleship class was kind of looking at, let's get back to the basics. What are the fundamentals? And to me, I think probably the two most fundamental claims or beliefs regarding Christianity is belief in God and belief in Jesus' resurrection. I don't really see how there's any way around those things. And so I want to look at those two things. What is the actual evidence that we have for the existence of God? What are the reasons and arguments for God's existence? How can we say that we believe in God? And then also I want to look at the evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus and how it can kind of be easy to get in this mindset that, something that happened so long ago before we all had video cameras in our pockets, what sort of evidence could we possibly have for something 2,000 years ago of a guy who died for 3 days and then walked out of the tomb 3 days later? And so I'm going to look at it. So first, I want to look at the reasons and arguments for God's existence. And so tonight, just kind of the style of it, I'm getting ready to give you like a dump truck full of information. And we are recording tonight, which is something we hadn't done the last few weeks, so this will be up on our YouTube channel probably within the next week. And so I understand this is a lot of information, and it might be hard to grasp or process all just right here, and so we are recording it, so you'll be able to go back and watch it. If you like, I'll even email you my notes and send you my sources and stuff to everything, all the information that I got. So with that being said, okay, let's look at some of the reasons and arguments for God's existence. Now, before I get into them, I'm going to give you three tonight, and there's a ton more than this, but obviously we're limited for time, so I have to just, limit to a few things. So one of the things that's been cool is we've opened up these things for questions and a little bit of a, feedback and discussion. So I want to first kind of open up a couple questions for you guys. And so I'd like to hear from you. For those of you who have unsaved or non-Christian friends or family members, what are some of the reasons that maybe they've told you that is keeping them from believing in God or making a commitment to Christ? And then also, maybe for you in this room, before you believed in God or before you were a Christian, what was it specifically maybe that was keeping you from belief in God? And I'll just open up the floor and let's just hear what anybody has to say. So who's got something for me? Why bad things happen? Yeah, the problem of pain. Yeah, how could such a good, powerful God allow pain and suffering and all that stuff? I think if I ask, show of hands, how many have heard that or their friends? Yeah, okay, everybody. That's usually the main one. So anybody else, any other different things that they know of, or for you personally? Yeah. Yeah. Right, sure. All the violence committed in the name of Christianity or of God. Yeah, that's a big one too. Anybody else? Science and religion. Yeah, the seeming conflict there between science and religion and trying to reconcile that sort of tension. Greg, it looked like you. Hmm. And so, yeah, trying to figure out the truth claims and what the meat of it's all about, kind of thing, right? Regarding back to the problem of pain, because that's typically the biggest one. I've watched a lot of Christian apologetics and people who give lectures and debates on God and Christianity, and that's usually kind of the main one that they talk about. That's kind of one of the hardest ones to kind of refute and overcome. And I heard this study just recently as I was preparing for this that it's like 70 to 80% of people who don't believe because of emotional reasons, not intellectual ones. And I think it's that problem of pain is that's that emotional thing that we all feel it, we all experience it, we all know what that's like to deal with tragedy. The interesting thing about that is the flip side is also true. 70 to 80% of people who do believe because of emotional reasons and not necessarily intellectual ones as well. And so let me just ask one more question. For those of you who call yourselves a Christian, I think it's probably safe to assume that everybody in here does. What was it that convinced you? What was it that maybe convinced you that God exists or was real, or convinced you or convicted you to, accept Christ as your Savior? Let's hear from you. What was it? Was there one thing or maybe multiple things? Anybody got anything? If not, that's okay. Not going to hell. Okay. All right. Salvation of your soul. Yeah. 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 Looking for that meaning in life and purpose that nothing else could fill. Yeah. Yeah. You prayed about something and it came. Awesome. Prayers were answered. Awesome. Okay. Well, let me get into this. So I'm going to look at 3 reasons for the existence of God, as I said. Now, this isn't something that I can prove scientifically. In other words, I can't prove the existence of God through some science experiment. It's not something, that is directly testable and I can get repeated results. It's not something I can really prove empirically, which is data we get with our 5 senses. I can't see God directly or touch him physically, but perhaps there's other types of evidence that could lead towards God's existence. So the first one we're going to look at is what is called the Kalam cosmological argument. All right, now that is a mouthful, and sometimes it's just referred to as the cosmological argument. But what this does is it kind of looks at evidence for the cause of the universe. This has been around since the 12th century, but it's kind of recently been kind of repopularized and modified a little bit by a guy by the name of William Lane Craig. He's a really well-known Christian apologist. I would recommend checking out any of his books or videos on YouTube. So he's kind of modified this argument. And the argument has 3 steps, and you see the word logical in there. So it's sort of this logical argument that gives you steps towards, if step 1 is true, it would lead you to 2, lead you to 3, and then it kind of logically concludes, okay, this could lead to the existence of God. And so it looks like this. Step number 1 is, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. Step 2, the universe began to exist. Step 3, therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning. And sort of the conclusion with there is that, well, then, what caused the universe to exist? Now, according to the most recent science, the universe is understood to have a beginning. And it is what is known as the singularity. And what that means is this. The universe is expanding. It's actually getting bigger. And scientists have therefore kind of concluded that at one point at the beginning of time, everything that now exists was condensed down into a single point. And it was a point that occupied no space and had an infinite amount of density. You may say, Jake, that doesn't make sense. How can something that has no space be infinitely dense? And I would say, yeah, that's exactly what the singularity means. We don't know. We don't understand. The best way I can put it to you is that something came from nothing. And so to kind of point towards the existence of God, everything of this world we can look at and say, well, that had a cause, that had a creator, that doesn't just exist because it popped into existence. It has a cause. So we would say that God is perhaps, I think, the best explanation for why the universe exists. And typically people might ask, well, Jake, okay, if the universe has a cause, then who caused God? And the problem with that question is you could just continually ask that question infinitely, because you could say, who caused God? Well, then who caused that, and who caused that, and who caused that? And so there has to be what is called the uncaused cause. There has to be something that is eternal, that doesn't need a cause, that has always been, always existed, that has the power and authority to call forth something from nothing, and we would say, God. So that's the cosmological argument. The next one is what's called the teleological argument. And this is sometimes referred to as the fine-tuning argument. And this looks at the constants and the laws of science that have allowed for life to exist. And based on those constants and those precise values in science, it seems that our universe was fine-tuned for life. So some of those constants are the force of gravity, the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces, which has to do with interaction between atoms and subatomic particles. There's a thing called the cosmological constant, which has to do with the expansion of the universe. And that's just a bunch of scientific stuff that, to be honest with you, kind of goes way over my head. But let me just look at one in particular, because I think it's something that we'll at least be able to grasp a little bit. So let's look at the force of gravity. So that's something we all at least understand for the most part. You know, you drop something, it falls. Okay, that's gravity. So the force of gravity is, it's a constant. It's why if I was to take a 1 pound weight and a 100 pound weight and drop them from the same height at exactly the same time, they'll hit the ground at exactly the same time, because the force of gravity is a constant. It's equal across everything. Well, the force of gravity is dialed into such a precise value that if it was different in 1 to 10 to the 60th power, there would be no life. Now, 10 to the 60th power is 1 with 60 zeros after it. And so what that means is this: if gravity was slightly more and the force was 1 more out of 10 to the 60th power, when the universe first began and was expanding, gravity would have been too strong and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself and there would be nothing. If it was 1 less, when the universe first began and things were expanding, there wouldn't be enough gravity for objects to come together, and so all the matter would have just spread out and scattered throughout the universe, and you'd have no planets and no stars and things like that. So to put that number into perspective, the number of cells in your body is like 10 to the 14th power. The number of seconds that have gone by since the beginning of time, which current estimates are about 13.7 billion years, is only 10 to the 20th power. And we're talking about gravity at 10 to the 60th, and that's just one of them. Okay, there's tons more that are just dialed into such a precise value that, again, it seems that our universe was finely tuned for life. And I think the best explanation for that is that there is a creator, a designer, God, who designed the universe in that way. I've heard this picture kind of explained that our universe exists on a razor's edge. In other words, we're just at precisely the exact point we need to be on to balance right on the razor's edge without falling over. So that is the teleological. The next one, and this is the third one, is called the moral argument. And this one was extremely powerful for me because those first two are cool to think about and they're, kind of mind-blowing sort of thing. But the moral argument, I think, hits a little bit deeper because it goes beyond just sort of education and actually goes into how we live and the decisions we make and, our behavior and interaction with one another, and it affects how we live. And the moral argument goes like this: if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. And where the tension will sometimes come from is in that first part there, and people will say, well, how do we know that there's no objective moral values if there is no God? And here's the thing with regards to morality. First of all, if there is no God, you'd have to say, okay, well, where do these moral values come from? And also, it is extremely difficult to ground morality in something natural of this world. And what I mean by that is this. So, it's easy to account for moral feelings. You can believe in anything. You can be atheist. You can be whatever, and say I have moral feelings. I feel that this is right and wrong. But it's way more difficult to account for what's called moral obligation. In other words, this is right. This is wrong. You ought to do this. You ought not to do that, regardless of how you personally feel, regardless of what you personally think. And so, we today, in America today, we all kind of believe in objective moral values, and I would say most people know what those values are, but it kind of changes depending on culture. And like we in America today would say things like, well, it's wrong to oppress people and marginalize minority groups. It's wrong for women to be considered as less than and treated as secondary citizens. Well, there's countries in the world where that is the reality, and we would say that's wrong. Well, why? Well, because we're appealing to a higher moral value, which means that if that's true, then that means there is, objective morality that transcends all feelings, all cultures, all, all of that things. And the reason why we have those beliefs is because in America today, we're actually, sort of our foundation is a Judeo-Christian worldview, which means we have these beliefs that first, life has intrinsic value and that men and women are created equal. And those come right out of the Bible that we read every single week. And I find that interesting because even people who are atheists, yeah, you may say you don't believe in God, but your actions, you're living out a Judeo-Christian worldview in your day-to-day life. And so I think there's a little bit of a conflict there. So, and so this was just really powerful for me because how do you ground objective morality in anything of this that's of the natural world? I just don't think you can. If there is no God, then anything and everything goes, and it's just my opinion against your opinion, and who's to say what Hitler and Stalin did was wrong? It's just they felt differently than what I felt. It's like, well, no, there is a right and a wrong, and I think the best explanation for that is because there is a God. And so those are three of the reasons for the existence of God. And now I want to move into my second part, and I'll kind of be spending the majority of my time here because this is something that I've just kind of recently been learning and researching, and I'm just super excited about. And we're going to talk about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So what I'm getting ready to tell you comes right out of this book, and I think I have a picture of it up on the screen. It's called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, and it's written by a guy by the name of Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Gary Habermas, though, I want to single him out because he's just the man. He is like literally the world's leading expert when it comes to the resurrection. He wrote his dissertation on it in college in the mid-'70s and has dedicated the last 40-plus years of studying and researching the resurrection of Jesus and has brought a lot of legitimacy to it, to those discussions in academic circles. He said when he was writing his dissertation in college, if you were to talk about the resurrection outside of like a church group, they'd pretty much just laugh you out of the room. And nowadays, there's even very skeptical and atheistic scholars that are taking this evidence very seriously. And so, as I said, everything I'm getting ready to tell you will come out of this book, and also a handful. He's got some lectures and interviews up on YouTube that I watched as well. And so this is his stuff. I figured why not go to the top dude when it comes to this, and I'll just tell you what he says. So now he presents a case, and I'm getting ready to give you, he calls them the 5 facts. So there's kind of 5 factual bits of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And these 5 facts, he uses what's called a minimalist facts approach. And so these will meet 2 requirements. One is the data is strongly evidenced. And number 2 is the data is accepted by virtually all scholars on the subject, even the skeptical ones, and virtually all is like 90% or higher. There's one of them that doesn't quite hit 90%. It's about 75%. I'll mention that again when we get there. But everything else will meet these minimalist facts approach. Now, he says kind of in the beginning of the book, he's like, listen, when we're dealing with history, I can't give you 100% absolute certainty. When we're dealing with history, we're dealing with probability. But I think we would all admit that, pretty much nothing in life is 100% anyways. And so there's an aspect of faith to life regardless of what you believe. You can kind of only reason yourself so far, and eventually it comes time to, I either believe it and I take the leap of faith, or I just don't and I don't. And so one of the things for me is faith for me is not, it's not blind faith. It's not an excuse to be ignorant about something. Faith to me is looking at what the evidence says, what the data shows, realizing, okay, I'm not going to get 100%, but based on what I've got, I'm going to act in faith and then take the leap of faith based on that evidence. And so I think this really helps do that. So I'm getting ready to give you the 5 facts. Let me just say one more thing. So he addresses a common objection here, and because this whole point is to be able to kind of learn it and talk about it with your friends and family. And he says, what do you do, when somebody says, well, Jake, that's great, but I don't trust the Bible. I don't believe the Bible. I think it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo. I don't believe any of this. And he says, okay, that's fine. Christians typically like to kind of throw around labels of, it's inerrant, authoritative, the Word of God, infallible, and all that. He just says, okay, for the sake of this, let's just take all that and throw it aside. And let's just look at this book as nothing more than a collection of ancient literature, ancient historical literature, a collection of books and letters. And he says it's still enough to make a case. So here we go. You guys interested? Okay, here we go. So here's the 5 facts. So fact number 1 is that Jesus died by crucifixion. So number 1 is crucifixion. So crucifixion was done by the Romans, and it was done to people who were violently rebellious. They were accused of treason. People weren't crucified for just, petty theft, stealing a loaf of bread. It was people who were considered a threat to Rome and an enemy of the state. And that's when you were crucified. And so crucifixion was a public embarrassment. It was extremely shameful. It was done in public, and people would gather and watch. And so it was totally shameful and embarrassing. And so for Christianity to start out declaring that its Savior, its Messiah, its Lord was nailed to a cross and crucified is pretty shocking. And it's certainly not the best way to go about starting a movement, especially if you're trying to attract followers. Come follow us. Our guy just got nailed to a cross. It's like, again, it's like, well, that's shameful. That's embarrassing. Why would you want me to follow this guy, kind of thing? And so, yeah, it would not be the best way. It'd probably be the worst way. But the crucifixion is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and it's also recorded in non-Christian sources as well. We have a guy by the name of Josephus, who is a first-century Roman Jewish historian. We also have a guy by the name of Tacitus, who is a first-century Roman senator and historian. Now, he goes into this in the book. I won't have time to break all this down, but he goes into different types of evidence that a historian will look for when they're trying to verify history. So a lot of what we know about history will just come from one source. In other words, somebody wrote it down and said, this event happened. When historians can find 2 sources, 2 independent sources corroborating a story, that's a layup. That's like, yes, that's awesome. When it comes to Jesus' death on the cross and by crucifixion, we don't have 1, we don't have 2, we have 9 independent sources corroborating this story. That's a Michael Jordan slam dunk as far as I'm concerned, right? And so it's just really powerful to know, again, yeah, it comes from the Bible. Oh, but Jake, I don't believe the Bible. Yeah, well, even 90% of the skeptical scholars are taking this as valid accounts. Also, we have non-biblical sources as well. So there's a quote by the name of John Dominic Crossan, who's a New Testament scholar. He says, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, period. There you go. Jesus was crucified. That's number 1. Number 2, and this one has a lot of meat on its bones, but this one is so powerful, is that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. And so how do we know that? Well, first of all, they claimed it. So let's spend some time talking about how do we know that this is actually what the disciples claimed, that they had an encounter with the risen Christ? Well, we have first the testimony of Paul. So the book of Acts reports that Paul and the disciples knew and fellowshiped together. And 1 Corinthians, which is written by Paul, chapter 15, I'm going to read to you verses 3 through 8 and then 11. Again, this is verifying the disciples' claims. This is what Paul writes. He says this, for what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, who is Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Verse number 11. Whether it is I or they referring to the disciples, this is what we preach and this is what you believed. So we have the testimony of Paul that this is what the disciples were claiming right here. Now, next we have what are called the oral traditions of the early church. And this is something that I learned for the first time while reading this book just in the past month or so that is just got me all sorts of fired up. So today we live in a written culture, which means we have terrible memories because everything's in our cell phones. And I would be willing to bet the majority of people in here probably don't even know their spouse's phone number by heart, because why do we need to? It's in our phone, right? And so, but back then, again, this is first century Roman Jewish culture. They didn't live in a written culture, they lived in an oral culture. And so their memories were very good. They were used to passing along information orally. Also, a lot of people, too, were illiterate, and so they wouldn't have been able to read things even if they were written down. So they had good memories to pass along things orally. It was actually not uncommon for some Jewish teenagers by the age of 14 to have the entire Old Testament memorized, if you can believe that. So, yeah, just totally different world. And so here's what's interesting about these oral traditions. Scholars have identified several instances of oral traditions copied in the New Testament. These include things like creeds, hymns, story summaries, and poetry. And what this means is that these are some of the very earliest teachings of the Christian church that actually predate the writing of the New Testament. Now, they obviously found themselves in writing once the New Testament was written, but again, these are oral traditions that were passed down even before the writing. Now, one of these earliest creeds actually comes from the verse that I just read to you in 1 Corinthians 15. I'm going to just reread verses 3 through 5 real quick, and I've got it highlighted. So here's what it is. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, and here it is. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. So this was something that was being passed along amongst the early Christians in the early churches. It was this creed, this story summary. It was very short, easy to memorize. It contained very important information to the message that they were getting along. And now many scholars believe that this was passed, that Paul received this from the disciples directly. Specifically from Peter and also James, the brother of Jesus. They believe he actually got it from them when he visited Jerusalem a few years after his conversion, which you can read about in Acts chapter 9. So if this is true and Paul got it from the disciples directly, that means that this oral creed can be dated back to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. And so here, one of the bits of historical evidence that historians look for is early accounts. How much time has passed from when said event happened to when it was first written about? This has been dated within 5 years. Here's the thing. Paul got it from Peter. Well, who did Peter get it from? He got it from the source. He got it from Jesus. He was an eyewitness. Some scholars believe that some of these early oral creeds were being memorized and preached and spoken between early Christians as early as 6 months after the resurrection of Jesus. There's a guy by the name of Bart Ehrman who is a really well-known skeptical New Testament scholar. He's an agnostic leaning towards atheist. Even Bart Ehrman dates it from 1 to 2 years at the most. So again, regarding earliness, 6 months to 2 years at the most is amazing. That's extremely rare to have accounts that were so close to the actual said event. The next one is we have the written works of the early church. And as you know, the resurrection is written and recorded in the 4 Gospels and in the book of Acts. These books were all written within 70 years of Jesus' death at most. The resurrection happened about 30 AD. There's usually a couple years of discrepancy depending on what scholars say in it, but mostly it's about 30 AD. The book of Mark was written between 65 and 70. Then you have Matthew, then Luke, and then John was written in about 95 AD. Now, okay, so you're at John is plus 65 years basically after the resurrection. And people will say, well, 65 years, that's a long time to get stuff wrong, to mess stuff up, to twist stuff around. And let me give you a comparison. And actually, it's kind of a funny coincidence because if you were here this past Sunday, my dad had a story about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, which was over 300 years before the time of Jesus. The earliest written sources we have of Alexander the Great, who, again, a very prominent historical figure, those earliest sources we have are 400 years after his death. And so when you kind of put this into comparison and then also add on to the fact that the New Testament writings contain these oral traditions which are dated to 6 months to maybe 2 years at the most, I think it really brings a lot of validity to what the New Testament or the gospel writers were writing. So We also have some non-biblical sources as well. Again, if you add all those up, you're going to get 9 sources confirming that this is what the disciples claimed. So we have multiple independent sources. We have very early accounts. We have eyewitness testimonies that this is what the disciples claimed, that they were witnesses of the risen Jesus. So that's what they claimed, but it even goes a step past that, because they not only claimed it, they believed it. And they believed it to the point of death. And it wasn't just their words, their actions and behavior also showed what they thought about Christ's resurrection. They put behavior and that belief behind their claims. So if you compare the disciples' behavior between the time Jesus was arrested to his crucifixion, and then what was happening? Well, they were denying him, they were abandoning him, they ran off in hidden fear. And then afterwards, well, we have accounts that they were martyred and died for their faith. It seems that something significant must have happened to cause that change in behavior. Now, specifically, what we have, again, strong evidence for, and that the vast majority of scholars accept, we have strong evidence for the martyrs of Peter, of the Apostle Paul, and also of James, the brother of Jesus. So I want to read to you a quote from a guy by the name of Ignatius. So this comes from a non-biblical source. Ignatius is a bishop in the Church of Antioch, which is like what they called the early pastors, and he wrote a letter to his friend's church. His friend was named Polycarp, and Polycarp was trained by the apostles and actually had conversations with the eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. So this is what Ignatius writes in 110 AD. He says this, "And when Jesus came to those with Peter, he said to them, 'Take, handle me, and see that I am not a bodiless demon.' And immediately they handled him and believed, having known his flesh and blood. Because of this, they also despised death, but beyond death they were found." And I highlighted that word despised there because the Greek word for despised is actually better translated as they cared nothing for or disregarded. And I gotta admit, when I first read that, I actually kind of started getting a little emotional, because I think it's safe to assume everybody in here has probably experienced death to some degree or another, friend, family member, loved one. We all know how painful that can be. And when you read this, they cared nothing for it. People don't talk about death that way. And I just thought it was so powerful that, who says that about death? Oh, death, the biggest fearful thing that most people have, the great mystery, the great unknown. Oh, death, yeah, that's not that big of a deal. Maybe because they had an encounter with the resurrected Christ and they knew that their Savior lived. And so, man, I thought that was just awesome. A typical objection here that people might throw out is that, well, Jake, lots of people have died for things that they believe to be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are. And that's true. You can look at the tragic event of 9/11 and, the terrorist attacks, and those people flew planes into the building because they believed, what they were doing was true. That doesn't mean that they are. Here's the difference between situations like that and the disciples. When those things happen, those people do those things, they have a belief based on someone else's word. But the disciples, they were eyewitnesses. They had a firsthand account. They knew what they were saying, if it was actually true or not. He writes in his book, he says, "Liars make bad martyrs." In other words, you may say that this is true, but you're not going to die for something if you really know deep down that it isn't. So they believed it. So let's move on to number 3. Number 3 is the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed. So I would imagine we're probably all familiar with Paul's conversion and his drastic conversion. What caused this sudden drastic change in Paul? How do you go from being a persecutor of Christianity to an apostle, not over a gradual, long period of time, but in an instant, right? Like, how does that happen? And this piece of evidence is interesting because it meets a different type of historical evidence, which is called attestation by an enemy. And it's one thing for for Christ's resurrection to be testified by friends, by the disciples who knew him, loved him, did life with him. But at this time, Paul was not a friend. He was an enemy of the faith. And for an enemy to, again, corroborate the story of saying, I had an encounter with the resurrected Christ is extremely powerful. So not only is his conversion recorded in the Bible, obviously reported by Paul himself, it's recorded by Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, but it's also recorded from 5 non-biblical sources as well. And so again, this gives us early, multiple, and firsthand testimony that Paul converted from an opponent of Christianity to one of its greatest proponents in a drastic, immediate encounter. So that's Paul. Number 4 is the skeptic, James, the brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. Now, James we actually know a little bit less about, but we do have strong evidence regarding James's story. So the evidence we have was that James was a very pious Jewish believer who strictly followed the Jewish law. When Paul wrote the letter of Galatians, which you can read about in Galatians chapter 2, he condemns legalistic men claiming affiliation with James, who started to fall back into this Jewish law, this very legalistic, religious, Jewish law-abiding behavior. And so it kind of gives us a little bit of an inkling, and there's other stuff as well that he talks about, that James was a very pious, legalistic believer. The gospel reports that James was actually an unbeliever during Jesus' ministry. You can read about that in Mark chapter 3, Mark chapter 6, John chapter 7. 1 Corinthians 15, which again, that verse that I read to you, we have documentation that Jesus appeared to James. And then after the resurrection, we see James as a leader and a pastor in one of the New Testament churches. And so we can kind of follow this trajectory of James going from an unbeliever, having an encounter with Jesus, to going to a pastor of one of the New Testament churches. James also died as a martyr, which we have from 3 non-biblical sources as well. And so again, it begs the question, what caused the sudden change in James's life? Well, maybe he had an encounter with the risen Jesus. So that brings me to my 5th and final one, and this one I love because number 5 is the tomb was empty, everybody. The tomb was empty. And so now this is the only one, it doesn't fully meet that 90 percentile, but like I said, it hits about 75% of scholars accept the empty tomb evidence. So how do we know that the tomb was actually empty? So number 1 is we have what's called the Jerusalem factor. So Jesus was executed in Jerusalem, and it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground if there was actually a still body in the tomb. Because all the Roman authorities would have had to do is pull the stone away, get in there, exhume the corpse, display it in public, and say, here's the guy. But that's not what happened. That would have crushed the message of Christianity. And now some people object and say, well, the reason why they did that or they didn't do that is because his body would have been unrecognizable, so they wouldn't have been able to confirm if it was Jesus or not. And the thing about that is, first, we obviously don't know the exact weather report on those days, but we know a good deal about the climate of Jerusalem, and it's actually an extremely dry climate, and so it's not a stretch to say that the body would have still been recognizable after even up to 50 days, and we're only dealing with 3 days. And regardless of the condition of the body, it still would have been at least beneficial for the authorities to display something because it would have detracted some. And so anything but an empty tomb would really have been devastating to the resurrection account. And if a body had been produced, we almost certainly would have had some sort of written account of it, except we don't. So that's the Jerusalem factor. The next thing we have is another case of enemy attestation. So rather than pointing to an empty tomb, the early critics accused Jesus' disciples of stealing the body. Now, this isn't refuting that possibility. However, we kind of refuted that regarding the disciples' beliefs, which again, if they were lying and stole the body, then why would they have died for what they were lying about? But the thing is that the claims that the disciples stole the body really all confirms that the tomb was empty, because why would you claim the disciples stole the body if there was a body in the tomb? So the only reason you have to say that they stole the body is because, hey, look, the tomb's actually empty. And this is actually the only known opposing theory we have of Jesus' enemies at that time, is the stolen body. And finally, we know that the tomb was empty because of the testimony of women. This one's really cool. If somebody is concocting a story in an attempt to deceive others, they're not going to make up information that would potentially hurt the credibility of their story. Now, in all four Gospels, women are listed as the primary witnesses of Jesus' empty tomb. Now, during that time in Jewish and Roman cultures, women were considered secondary citizens, and their testimonies were questionable at best and oftentimes regarded the same as somebody who is a thief. And so given this low first century view of women, it seems very unlikely that the disciples would have made this story up and said that the first witnesses were women. This would have been detrimental and harmful to the message at the time. And so the claims of the empty tomb seem to be credible in light of this principle of, it's called the principle of embarrassment. It would be information that would be detrimental. You wouldn't include that if you were trying to make something up. So now the empty tomb, proves little all by itself, but when you add this to the other four things, I think it comes across as pretty powerful and pretty significant. There's a quote here for you, a guy by the name of William Wand, who is a former Oxford University church historian. He writes this: "All the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history." So that is the 5 facts. Now, I'll kind of wrap this up. Got a few things to add to conclude. But what these 5 facts do is they hope to accomplish 2 things. First of all, they provide compelling evidence for Jesus' resurrection, but also they stand as data that must be accounted for by any opposing theory. And I think that's a key one. So, by the way, I can't encourage you enough to read this book if this is something you're interested in. You may say, well, Jake, you just gave it all to us. I actually only gave you about the first third, okay? The 5 facts only cover about the first 80 pages. The rest of it, he actually goes into going through questions and objections and listing all the different theories and explanations that people have and how those don't best account for the evidence and all that stuff. And some of the common other theories, people say, oh, it was just a myth and that story didn't gain traction until years later and all that stuff. And he's, that's not what happened. That doesn't best account for the data. Oh, it was just a conspiracy. The disciples were lying. They were in cahoots. They were trying to, promote an agenda. That one doesn't account for the evidence as well either. Some people think that there was this mass hallucination, that the disciples, they didn't really see the risen Jesus. They were just all hallucinating and they thought they saw something, and that one doesn't cut it either. And those are kind of some of the big ones that he just, he goes through, but he goes through a ton more. I want to read to you this quote as I conclude. And there's this lady by the name of Paula Fredrickson, who is from Boston University. She says this. This is in regards to the disciples' claims to have had an encounter with the risen Christ. She says this: "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something." And I just can't help but laugh at that quote a little bit, because it's like, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck and acts like a duck, maybe it's a duck. And it's like, they made the claims, all the historical evidence supports it, but, I don't know, I wasn't there. But it's like, well, maybe because they really had an encounter with the risen Christ. I don't know, right? Here's what's interesting, though, about these alternative, Gary Habermas calls them naturalistic explanations or alternative theories. He says that really today, amongst the kind of specialized scholars regarding the resurrection, only like 10% of them try to propose any sort of alternate explanation. He says the reason why it's so low nowadays is because when they do, they pretty much get crushed by the evidence. And so when it comes to the resurrection, there is really only about 2 main viewpoints. And here's what they are. Number 1 is, I don't know. And typically the people who hold this viewpoint also have a worldview that doesn't allow for the possibility of miracles, that miracles are impossible. And so you're asking me to accept a miraculous claim. My worldview doesn't accept that, and so I don't know. And I think there's there's a level of skepticism that's healthy. We shouldn't just accept things blindly, but I think there's a level of skepticism that becomes so much to where you just sit around poking holes in everything that you're just, again, left with, I don't know. I'm not going to take a stance on anything because, I'm not convinced. I'm not 100% convinced. It's like, well, that's just not how life works, most of the time. And so the thing with the I don't know is, the whole point when you're conducting, you're doing scientific experiment, conducting historical research is to, you do the research, you record your results, and you formulate a conclusion based on the evidence. And I don't know doesn't do that. You just are left with nothing. The whole point is to say, well, this is an explanation that best accounts for the evidence that we've gathered. And to just say, I don't know, it doesn't do that. And so that leads us to viewpoint number 2. And I think you probably all know what I'm going with this, is, ladies and gentlemen, he really walked out of that tomb. And again, it's not 100% certainty, but for me personally, I'll say I am convinced beyond reasonable doubt. And it was cool when I was writing this and putting this together, I was reminded of a quote from Sherlock Holmes. And I love Sherlock Holmes. I've read some of his stories and I like the movies and TV shows, but Sherlock Holmes has this quote that I think is really applicable here. Trying to solve mysteries, and here's what he says. He says, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Once you've eliminated all the other explanations, this explanation, maybe accounts for a couple bits of the evidence, but certainly not all 5, and this doesn't account for it, and this doesn't account for it. Whatever you're left with, however improbable. Is it improbable? Well, people don't walk out of the grave after 3 days of being dead, so okay, but whatever you're left with, however improbable, must be the truth. And it's not 100% certainty, but it is the best explanation we have for the evidence and the data that we have. And I'll kind of wrap up here and just sort of say this as I conclude. I've had just an absolute blast studying this and learning this over the last 4 to 6 weeks or whatever it's been. And I've kind of felt like a scientific detective historian sort of thing. It's just been really cool. I absolutely love this type of stuff. And I've been a Christian my entire life. I've been in church, pretty much every Sunday since I was born. I'm 30 years old now. And I would always say, I believe Jesus. I believe, he's the Son of God. He died on the cross for my sins and resurrected. And sometimes it's maybe easy to get, I'll steal another thing from this past Sunday's message, maybe a little apathetic, to where it's like kind of you believe something for so long and it's like you just kind of accept it. But then when you actually go back into it and investigate and you're like, oh wow, there's something here. This isn't just some crazy fairy tale claim. This isn't just, oh well, the Bible says it's true, so that clears it up then. And no, even skeptical scholars, they may not be convinced, they may not claim to be Christians, but even the most skeptical scholars are saying, there's something here. There's something that's interesting about this story. And it's just so powerful, because then when you kind of get confronted with this evidence and then you realize like what Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection actually means. And then it just kind of, that whole aspect of it hits you, because if Jesus Christ really lived, really died, really said what he said, and really walked out of that tomb, that means your sins really are forgiven. That means that you are adopted into the family of the Most High. That means that you have direct access to the master and the creator of the universe. That means that you are in right standing with him and that he loves you unconditionally because of what Jesus did. I mean, holy smokes. What else is there to say, right? It's just, my goodness. It's beautiful. It's powerful. It's the greatest story ever told. It's the greatest hope for humanity. It is any word you want to throw at it. It's life-changing. It's unbelievable. It's everything. It's absolutely everything. And that's all I got for you. Thank you, everybody. So, I don't know if anybody's gotten any comments, questions. I can't guarantee I'll have answers, but I'll just, I guess, open it up. Thank you again so much for everybody coming out. Yes, Kimber. Yes, book title is The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas. The guy who's the co-author is actually a student of his. He's also a New Testament scholar. But yeah, like I said, we're recording this. I understand that's a ton of information, and it's, part of it's an abbreviated version because it's like, I have 45 minutes to an hour, so get the book. It's an awesome book. I'll email you my notes if you want to know my sources and all that stuff. So, yeah, any other questions or comments, just anything? If not, then we'll be good to go. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.